In the summer of 1931, China faced one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history, the 1931 China floods, also known as the Yangtze-Huai River floods. Spanning from June to August, these floods devastated central and eastern China, leaving a trail of destruction and loss across major cities like Wuhan, Nanjing, and beyond. This catastrophe was not just an isolated event, but the culmination of a series of extreme weather conditions that had plagued the region for several years. The backstory of these floods begins in the late 1920s, when China was already grappling with severe droughts from 1928 to 1930. These droughts had a significant impact on the country, drying up rivers and reducing water levels to dangerous lows. But the winter of 1930 brought a harsh twist, as heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures covered the mountainous areas with thick layers of snow and ice. As the winter gave way to spring in 1931, this snow and ice began to melt, and the resulting water flowed downstream into the Yangtze River. Ordinarily, the Yangtze River and its surrounding areas experience seasonal flooding during the spring, summer, and fall. However, the continuous melting combined with heavy rainfall in early 1931 created a situation that was far from ordinary. By June, those living in low-lying areas along the river had already been forced to abandon their homes as water levels rose at an alarming rate. The summer of 1931 was marked by intense cyclonic activity, with 9 cyclones hitting the region in July alone, far above the average of 2 per year. These cyclones brought unprecedented amounts of rain, further swelling the rivers and causing water levels to reach new heights. By the time the floodwaters peaked in August, much of central and eastern China was underwater. The floodwaters inundated an area of about 180,000 square kilometers, roughly equivalent in size to the combined states of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Cities like Wuhan were submerged, and the scale of the disaster was so immense that it quickly overwhelmed local authorities and communities. This introduction sets the stage for understanding how the 1931 floods developed into one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in human history. The combination of natural factors, ranging from severe droughts and harsh winters to unrelenting cyclones, created a perfect storm that would lead to untold devastation in the months to come. As we move forward, we'll explore how these events unfolded, the sheer scale of destruction that followed, and the lasting impact of this disaster on China and its people. As 1931 began, a series of environmental conditions converged to create the perfect storm for what would become one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. In the years leading up to the flood, China had experienced a long drought from 1928 to 1930, which left the ground parched and unable to absorb water effectively. The winter of 1930-1931 was particularly harsh, with severe cold spells that deposited large amounts of snow and ice across the mountainous regions. This snow and ice were set to become a major factor in the unfolding disaster. As the harsh winter gave way to spring, the snow and ice began to melt rapidly, sending torrents of water downstream into the Yangtze River and its tributaries. Ordinarily, this region would experience 3 distinct periods of high water: spring, summer, and fall. But in 1931, the water flow was relentless, combining all 3 high water periods into one continuous, overwhelming deluge. As early as June, the situation was already dire, with heavy rains compounding the melting snow and ice. The Yangtze River swelled to levels not seen since records began, causing those living in low-lying areas to abandon their homes in fear of what was to come. Adding to the chaos, the summer of 1931 saw an unprecedented level of cyclonic activity. 9 cyclones struck the region in July alone, a sharp increase from the usual 2 per year. The torrential rains brought by these storms saturated the ground further, with 4 weather stations along the Yangtze River reporting rainfall exceeding 600 millimeters for the month. The river, already swollen from months of heavy water flow, reached dangerously high levels, pushing against dikes and levees that had held firm for decades. Despite the growing danger, preparations for such a catastrophe were minimal. The flood control infrastructure, already weakened by years of neglect and mismanagement, was simply not equipped to handle the massive volume of water. Communities along the river, already strained from years of drought and economic hardship, were caught off guard by the severity of the situation. Efforts to strengthen dikes and build temporary barriers were quickly overwhelmed as the water levels continued to rise. By late July, it was clear that a disaster of unprecedented scale was imminent. The river's water levels were now at their highest point in living memory, and the first signs of flooding began to appear in low-lying areas. People scrambled to save what they could, but the sheer magnitude of the impending flood left little time for effective evacuation. The stage was set for the 1931 China floods to unleash their full fury on the unsuspecting population. The catastrophic impact of the 1931 China floods began to fully manifest in August. The relentless rains continued, and the Yangtze River, along with other major rivers like the Huai and Yellow Rivers, could no longer contain the immense volume of water. On August 1st, the Yangtze River burst its banks, and the floodwaters surged into the surrounding countryside, overwhelming dikes and inundating vast areas of land. Entire towns and villages were swallowed by the advancing waters. The floods swept through the landscape with unstoppable force, destroying homes, farmlands, and infrastructure. Roads and railways were submerged, cutting off communication and transportation routes, making it nearly impossible for aid to reach the affected areas. The situation was dire, and the people caught in the flood's path had little chance to escape. As the floodwaters spread, the scale of the devastation became clearer. The city of Wuhan, one of China's most important industrial and commercial centers, was among the hardest hit. The city was submerged under several feet of water, leaving only the tops of buildings visible in some areas. The residents of Wuhan, along with millions of others across the floodplain, were forced to seek refuge on rooftops, in trees, and on any high ground they could find. Many clung to makeshift rafts or debris, desperately trying to survive. In the countryside, the situation was even more grim. The floodwaters turned fertile farmlands into vast muddy lakes. Crops that were nearing harvest were destroyed, leading to widespread food shortages. Livestock drowned in the rising waters, further exacerbating the looming famine. The floods also displaced millions of people, leaving them homeless and without access to clean water, food, or medical care. The death toll began to climb rapidly. Drowning claimed the lives of countless individuals in the immediate aftermath of the flood, but the disaster's impact went far beyond the initial surge of water. The stagnant floodwaters became breeding grounds for disease, and epidemics of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever spread rapidly through the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in which survivors were forced to live. Malnutrition and exposure to the elements further weakened the already vulnerable population. The government, already stretched thin by economic troubles and political instability, struggled to respond effectively to the crisis. Relief efforts were hampered by the scale of the disaster and the sheer number of people in need. Local authorities and international aid organizations did what they could, but resources were limited and the needs were overwhelming. As the floodwaters slowly receded, they left behind a landscape of devastation. The physical destruction was immense, but the human toll was even greater. The 1931 China floods were not just a natural disaster, but a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The country would be left to grapple with the aftermath for years to come. In the aftermath of the 1931 China floods, the devastation was almost unimaginable. As the floodwaters gradually receded, they revealed a landscape utterly transformed by the disaster. Farmlands that had once been lush and fertile were now barren, coated in a thick layer of silt and debris. The flood had destroyed crops, homes, and infrastructure, leaving millions of people without shelter or means of livelihood. The immediate concern in the weeks following the flood was the humanitarian crisis. With millions of people displaced, there was an urgent need for food, clean water, and medical care. Relief efforts were mounted, but they were hampered by the sheer scale of the disaster. Roads and railways remained damaged or submerged, making it difficult to transport supplies to the worst affected areas. The government, already struggling with internal political instability, found it challenging to coordinate a response on such a massive scale. In the refugee camps that sprung up across the region, conditions were dire. Overcrowding and unsanitary living conditions led to the rapid spread of diseases. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever claimed thousands of lives, adding to the already staggering death toll. The lack of adequate food supplies resulted in widespread malnutrition, and many survivors succumbed to hunger and disease. The social impact of the floods was profound. Families were torn apart, with many losing loved ones to the floodwaters or the subsequent epidemics. The loss of homes and livelihoods meant that entire communities were plunged into poverty, with little hope of recovery in the near term. The psychological trauma of the disaster left deep scars on the survivors, many of whom had witnessed unimaginable horrors during the flood. The economic consequences were equally severe. The destruction of farmlands and the loss of the harvest led to food shortages and skyrocketing prices, The agricultural sector, which was the backbone of China's economy at the time, was decimated. This in turn led to a sharp increase in poverty and unemployment, as farmers and laborers found themselves without work. The disaster also had long-term political repercussions. The government's inadequate response to the crisis fueled public dissatisfaction and unrest. The inability to provide effective relief and the perceived indifference of the authorities to the suffering of the people undermined the government's legitimacy and contributed to the growing sense of discontent across the country. International aid did arrive, but it was not enough to meet the overwhelming needs of the affected population. While various relief organizations and foreign governments provided assistance, the scale of the disaster meant that many people continued to suffer for months and even years after the floodwaters had receded. The 1931 China floods were a turning point in the nation's history. They exposed the vulnerabilities of the country's infrastructure and governance and highlighted the need for better disaster preparedness and response. The lessons learned from this catastrophe would eventually lead to changes in flood control measures and disaster management strategies, but for those who lived through it, the impact of the floods would be felt for a lifetime. The legacy of the 1931 China floods is a somber reminder of the catastrophic power of natural disasters and the profound impact they can have on society. In the years that followed, efforts were made to prevent such a tragedy from occurring again. The government began investing in more comprehensive flood control measures, including the construction of dams, levees, and improved drainage systems. These initiatives were aimed at better managing the country's vast river systems and reducing the risk of future floods. One of the key lessons learned from the 1931 floods was the importance of early warning systems in disaster preparedness. The lack of timely information and coordinated response had exacerbated the scale of the disaster. In response, meteorological and hydrological monitoring systems were gradually improved, allowing for more accurate predictions of potential floods and better planning for evacuation and relief efforts. However, the memory of the 1931 floods also served as a stark reminder of the need for sustainable development and environmental stewardship. Deforestation, land reclamation, and other practices that disrupted natural water flows were recognized as contributing factors to the severity of the floods. This realization led to increased awareness of the importance of protecting natural ecosystems as a means of mitigating the impact of future floods. On a social level, the floods had a lasting impact on the people of China. The survivors carried with them the trauma and loss of the disaster, and the event became a defining moment in the collective memory of the nation. It was a time of immense suffering, but also of resilience, as communities came together to rebuild their lives in the aftermath. The 1931 China floods remain one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history, with an estimated death toll ranging from 1 million to 4 million people. The exact number may never be known, but the scale of the tragedy is undeniable. The disaster highlighted the need for stronger infrastructure, better disaster preparedness, and a more compassionate response to those in need. In the decades since, China has made significant strides in disaster management and flood control. Modern technology and improved infrastructure have reduced the risk of such a catastrophic event occurring again. Yet, the memory of the 1931 floods continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance, preparation, and the human cost of environmental neglect. As we reflect on the 1931 China floods, we are reminded of the delicate balance between nature and human civilization. It is a balance that requires constant attention and respect, for when it is disrupted, the consequences can be devastating. The floods of 1931 are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity and a sobering reminder of the need to protect our environment and prepare for the challenges that nature may bring. The Banqiao Dam, located in China's Henan province, was part of an ambitious effort to control flooding in the Huai River basin. Built in the 1950s, the dam was designed with the best available technology at the time, intended to prevent the devastating seasonal floods that had plagued the region for centuries. Spanning over 380 meters wide and standing more than 118 meters tall, Banqiao was a symbol of progress in modern engineering. Initially, the dam was seen as a success, holding back immense quantities of water during the rainy seasons and protecting the nearby towns and villages from the historical flooding that had claimed so many lives in the past. However, Behind its impressive structure lay vulnerabilities that would later be exposed in a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. The reliance on outdated engineering models and insufficient attention to safety measures left the dam in a precarious position, especially in the face of an extreme weather event. Adding to this was a growing political pressure during China's Great Leap Forward. Speed in construction was prioritized, and some design features, like its spillway capacity, were underdeveloped. Local populations were unaware of these limitations, continuing to build and thrive in the dam's protective shadow, unaware of the growing risk. But in 1975, nature would put the dam's limits to the ultimate test. In early August 1975, Typhoon Nina formed off the coast of Taiwan, initially expected to weaken before reaching mainland China. However, what followed was a dramatic intensification that no one could have predicted. By the time Typhoon Nina made landfall in the Henan province, it had transformed into a powerful and sustained weather event, bringing with it an unrelenting deluge of rain over several days. As the storm approached, meteorologists grew increasingly concerned about the potential strain on the country's dam infrastructure. The Banqiao Dam, in particular, was identified as being in a vulnerable position due to its reliance on spillways that had not been designed for such extreme levels of rainfall. Between August 5th and 7th, the region experienced unprecedented downpours, with over 1,600 millimeters of rain falling, equivalent to what the area would normally receive in an entire year. The torrential rains exceeded even the most conservative projections, triggering flash floods, landslides, and swelling rivers. Government officials and engineers tried to manage the rapidly rising water levels, but their efforts were hampered by miscommunication and outdated data. The evacuation of the surrounding areas was delayed as authorities hoped the dam would hold, relying on faulty assumptions about its design's resilience. As water continued to rise, the situation became critical. With the storm still raging, the dam's reservoirs were soon filled beyond capacity, and the spillways designed to release excess water were simply inadequate to cope with the overwhelming volume. Despite the increasing danger, local residents remained largely unaware of the looming disaster. On the night of August 8, 1975, after days of relentless rain, the Banqiao Dam reached its breaking point. Cracks started to appear along the structure as the dam could no longer hold back the overwhelming pressure of the floodwaters. In the early hours of August 8th, the dam finally gave way, releasing a staggering 700 million cubic meters of water in a matter of hours. The collapse unleashed an unstoppable tidal wave, estimated to be over 10 kilometers wide and traveling at a speed of nearly 50 kilometers per hour. The water ripped through the countryside, obliterating everything in its path. Entire villages were washed away in minutes as the floodwaters surged through the plains. Houses, roads, farms, and infrastructure were destroyed, leaving nothing but devastation behind. The sheer force of the water was unimaginable as it uprooted trees, overturned vehicles, and swept away bridges, cutting off escape routes and isolating entire communities. The destruction was exacerbated by the collapse of several other smaller dams downstream, creating a domino effect that magnified the impact of the flood. The people living in the floodplains had no time to react. Without adequate warning systems in place, most were asleep when the dam broke, unaware of the wall of water rushing toward them. In the space of a few hours, what had been a landscape of farmland and small villages was transformed into a vast lifeless lake of mud and debris. Over 85,000 people are estimated to have drowned in the immediate aftermath of the dam's collapse. The collapse of the Banqiao Dam was only the beginning of the disaster. In the days and weeks that followed, the situation grew even worse as survivors faced a severe humanitarian crisis. With entire towns submerged and infrastructure wiped out, the region was plunged into chaos. Food and clean drinking water were in short supply, and the destruction of roads and bridges made it almost impossible for rescue teams to reach the hardest-hit areas. In addition to the flood-related deaths, an estimated 145,000 people died from the secondary effects of the disaster. Disease outbreaks spread quickly in the aftermath, as the lack of clean water and proper sanitation contributed to the rapid spread of illness. Malnutrition became rampant, as crops were destroyed and livestock drowned in the floodwaters, cutting off food supplies for the surviving population. Many survivors were forced to live in makeshift shelters with little to no medical assistance, as hospitals and clinics had been swept away or severely damaged. The Chinese government, already dealing with political challenges and economic strains, struggled to mount an effective response. Relief efforts were slow to mobilize, and with communications down in much of the region, it took days before the full extent of the disaster was even understood by the outside world. As rescue teams finally reached the isolated areas, the scale of the damage became painfully clear. Millions of people were displaced and entire communities had been wiped off the map. The survivors faced not only the loss of their homes, but also the devastating emotional toll of losing family members, neighbors, and entire livelihoods in a matter of hours. The Banqiao Dam disaster remains one of the deadliest dam failures in history, with a death toll estimated to exceed 230,000 people. Beyond the immediate loss of life, the disaster had a profound impact on China's approach to engineering, disaster preparedness, and emergency response. It exposed the risks of underestimating the power of natural disasters, as well as the consequences of prioritizing speed and political goals over safety and construction projects. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, China implemented major reforms in its dam building policies. Stricter safety regulations were introduced, and many of the country's older dams were retrofitted or rebuilt to withstand extreme weather events. The government also invested in improved early warning systems and flood control measures to prevent such a disaster from ever happening again. Additionally, there was a growing acknowledgement of the importance of transparency and accurate communication between authorities and the public, as the delay in evacuating affected areas had been a major factor in the high death toll. Despite these changes, the Banqiao Dam disaster remains a somber reminder of the devastating consequences when infrastructure fails. The survivors, many of whom lost everything in the floods, continue to live with the memory of that tragic night, and the region itself has never fully recovered from the damage. Today, the story of Banqiao serves as a cautionary tale for countries around the world, highlighting the need for rigorous safety standards, proper maintenance, and proactive disaster management to protect against the unpredictable forces of nature. The 1887 Yellow River flood in China is one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. It began in late September of that year during the Qing dynasty, when the Yellow River, also known as the Huanghe, broke through its dikes, causing massive flooding across northern China. This event unfolded near the city of Banqiao in Henan province. The floodwaters swept through the low-lying plains, destroying everything in their path. At least 900,000 people lost their lives, though estimates suggest the number may have been as high as 2 million. For centuries, the Yellow River had been both a blessing and a curse for those living near it. The fertile soil deposited by the river supported agriculture, but the same silt also raised the riverbed over time, making the region prone to devastating floods. As the river rose higher and higher, farmers built dikes to contain its waters. In September 1887, however, the river finally burst through its barriers, and what followed was a tragedy of unimaginable scale. The 1887 flood stands as a dark chapter in China's long history of struggle against the forces of nature. Now, in the months leading up to the 1887 flood, China had been experiencing heavy rains. The Yellow River, already known for its unpredictable nature, swelled under the pressure of continuous rainfall. The river, often referred to as China's sorrow, carries an immense amount of silt, making it difficult to control and prone to overflowing. As the riverbed had been rising over time, it was only a matter of time before the dikes and dams that protected the villages and farmland would give way. On September 28th, the worst fears came true. The river's waters broke through at Huaiwanku, near the city of Banqiao, a major commercial and agricultural center. Despite efforts to maintain the dikes, there was little that could be done once the river's levels rose too high. The floodwaters began to spill over into the surrounding areas, moving with alarming speed across the plains. Initial preparations, like reinforcing the dikes, proved ineffective in the face of such overwhelming force. As the waters surged, panic spread among the people living in nearby towns and villages. When the dikes broke on that late September day, the disaster unfolded with incredible speed. The floodwaters spread across 50,000 square miles, covering a vast area of northern China. Villages were swallowed whole, agricultural fields were washed away, and commercial centers were drowned. The force of the water was so powerful that it wiped out homes, uprooted trees, and left entire communities submerged. The flood did not just cause physical destruction, it also unleashed chaos as people scrambled to find safety. Thousands of lives were lost in the first days alone, as the water swept through towns, leaving little chance for escape. The scale of the disaster was enormous. Cities were destroyed and transportation and communication lines were cut off. People were trapped in the floodwaters, clinging to rooftops or being swept away by the current. There were no warnings that could have prepared people for the magnitude of the disaster. The floodwaters continued to rise and the devastation seemed endless. The days following the flood were equally tragic. The flood not only destroyed homes and farmland, but it also left 2 million people homeless. With so many displaced, disease began to spread rapidly in the overcrowded refugee camps. Epidemics broke out, taking nearly as many lives as the flood itself. Without clean water, food, or medical care, survivors were left to fend for themselves in a devastated landscape. The damage to the land was equally severe. Thousands of acres of agricultural land were ruined, and entire towns were wiped from the map. The economic impact was felt for years as the region struggled to recover. Crops were lost, and the once thriving commercial centers were abandoned. For the people of northern China, the 1887 flood was not just a temporary disaster. It had long-lasting consequences that would affect the region for decades. The loss of life, the destruction of communities, and the lasting effects of disease and famine made it one of the most devastating natural disasters in Chinese history. The 1887 Yellow River flood left a deep scar on the history of China, with the estimated death toll ranging from 900,000 to 2 million people. It is regarded as one of the deadliest floods in human history. The massive scale of destruction and loss of life made this flood a symbol of the ongoing struggle between the people of China and the unforgiving forces of nature. The Yellow River, which had sustained life for centuries with its fertile soil, had also taken life on a scale that was hard to comprehend. The disaster spurred future efforts to control the river, including the construction of larger dikes and flood control systems. However, the inherent danger of the Yellow River continued, with future floods striking the region again in later years. The 1887 flood stands as a reminder of how quickly nature can turn deadly, especially when human preparations prove inadequate against such overwhelming forces. The legacy of this flood is still felt today. It remains one of the most tragic events in China's history, remembered not only for the destruction it caused, but also for the resilience of the people who survived and rebuilt their lives in its aftermath. The early hours of July 28, 1976 seem no different from any other summer morning in Tangshan, a growing industrial city in northeastern China. Positioned in Hebei province, Tangshan was home to approximately 1 million people, many of whom were miners, factory workers, and their families. Life hummed along with an air of routine. Few could have imagined that this ordinary day would soon become etched in history as the setting for one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century. At precisely 3:42 a.m., an earthquake struck with a magnitude of 7.5 on the Richter scale. Its epicenter was located just 12 kilometers beneath the surface, a shallow depth that would amplify its destructive power. The region's geological makeup played a critical role in the disaster. Tangshan was situated on loose sedimentary soil, which exacerbated the seismic waves as they radiated outward. These amplified tremors turned the earth beneath the city into a rolling, heaving force of devastation. Adding to the catastrophe, Tangshan's urban development was not prepared for such a seismic event. The city lacked earthquake-resistant infrastructure, and many of its buildings were constructed from unreinforced masonry and other substandard materials. This left them vulnerable to collapse under the earthquake's immense force. When the quake struck, entire city blocks were razed in seconds, leaving little standing in its wake. The immediate aftermath was horrifying. Entire families were buried beneath rubble as buildings crumbled like sandcastles. Streets buckled, bridges snapped, and water mains ruptured, flooding parts of the city and making rescue efforts even more challenging. The ground itself became a hazard as fissures opened up, swallowing anything or anyone in their path. Communication lines were severed, isolating Tangshan from the outside world and delaying the flow of critical information about the scale of the disaster. The timing of the earthquake added to the tragedy. Striking while most residents were asleep in their homes, the death toll skyrocketed as people were caught completely off guard. Survivors later recounted how they were jolted awake by violent shaking, only to be engulfed by collapsing walls and falling debris. Darkness, chaos, and confusion overwhelmed the city as cries for help echoed into the night. Despite its seismic significance, there were no foreshocks to serve as a warning. While some animals reportedly exhibited unusual behavior in the hours before the quake, such as dogs barking incessantly and livestock acting erratically, these signs were not enough to prompt human action. This absence of clear warning further underscores the unexpected nature of the disaster. In the hours following the quake, Tangshan's true plight remained hidden from the world. Limited communication and China's tightly controlled media meant that the full scale of the disaster would not emerge immediately. For now, Tangshan's residents were left to grapple with the immense destruction and loss, unaided and largely unnoticed by the outside world. This marked the beginning of a disaster whose ripple effects would extend far beyond its epicenter, reshaping disaster response, preparedness, and urban planning in China and beyond. As the clock struck 3:42 in the early hours of late July, the peaceful city of Tangshan, still shrouded in the stillness of night, was torn apart by a seismic upheaval unlike anything its residents had experienced. The earthquake's force was swift, brutal, and uncompromising, generating seismic waves that spread destruction across a staggering area of over 3,000 square kilometers. The ground heaved violently, transforming solid earth into a liquid-like phenomenon known as soil liquefaction, a catastrophic process that caused buildings to tilt, sink, or collapse entirely. While the epicenter was located within Tangshan, the earthquake's effects radiated far beyond the city. Surrounding towns and rural areas were hit hard, with entire communities flattened in mere seconds. Structures ranging from modest village homes to industrial facilities crumbled under their relentless vibrations. The region's coal mines, a vital part of Tangshan's economy, were particularly devastated, trapping hundreds of workers underground. For those miners, survival became a race against time as tunnels caved in, cutting off both air and escape routes. The damage extended to critical infrastructure, further compounding the chaos. Railways were twisted into grotesque shapes, severing vital transportation links. Power plants were rendered inoperable, plunging the area into darkness, while water pipelines shattered, leaving survivors without clean water. Bridges that once connected the city to nearby regions were reduced to piles of twisted steel and concrete, isolating Tangshan further from external aid. One of the earthquake's most haunting aspects was its sheer speed. Experts later estimated that the most intense shaking lasted less than 15 seconds, yet the destruction it wrought was monumental. This brevity meant that those who might have reacted to the tremors had virtually no time to escape. Survivors described the moments of impact as akin to an apocalyptic storm, walls collapsing, roofs caving in, and the air filling with a deafening roar as the ground moved beneath them. Adding to the horror, the earthquake struck during a heat wave, compounding the physical and emotional toll on survivors. Temperatures soared, and without shelter, clean water, or medical supplies, conditions rapidly deteriorated. Many were forced to endure the blistering heat while searching for loved ones or trying to rescue neighbors trapped beneath the rubble. The sweltering conditions also accelerated the decomposition of bodies, posing significant health risks and further traumatizing those who remained. Another tragic element of the disaster was the widespread loss of life among children. Many schools in Tangshan were not built to withstand even minor earthquakes, let alone a seismic event of this magnitude. As a result, countless young lives were lost when classrooms collapsed, burying students and teachers under tons of debris. These heart-wrenching scenes left an indelible scar on the community and would later fuel demands for stricter building regulations and earthquake preparedness. Meanwhile, survivors faced a terrifying landscape of ruin. Fires broke out across the city as ruptured gas lines ignited, creating an additional hazard for those navigating the wreckage. The air became thick with smoke, dust, and the cries of those in pain or mourning their losses. Every moment was a test of resilience as individuals banded together to lift debris, carry the injured to makeshift medical stations, or dig with their bare hands in desperate attempts to find loved ones. Despite the enormity of the disaster, Tangshan's plight initially remained largely unknown to the outside world. The destruction of communication lines and the isolated nature of the region created a chilling silence that left even neighboring cities unaware of the unfolding tragedy. For the people of Tangshan, this isolation deepened their sense of abandonment, as it became clear that immediate help was not on the way. These early hours marked a critical juncture in what would become one of history's most significant natural disasters, setting the stage for an unparalleled story of survival, loss, and resilience. The devastation caused by the Tangshan earthquake unfolded on an almost unimaginable scale. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, creating a vast expanse of destruction where homes, schools, factories, and hospitals once stood. Over 90% of the city's buildings were either damaged or completely destroyed, leaving the majority of Tangshan's population without shelter. The widespread collapse of infrastructure compounded the chaos, forcing survivors to confront a harsh and unforgiving reality in the earthquake's immediate aftermath. The industrial heart of Tangshan, once a bustling hub of economic activity, was obliterated. Factories that powered the region's economy lay in ruins, and heavy machinery was scattered like toys across the landscape. Among the hardest hit were coal mines, which suffered catastrophic collapses, burying hundreds of workers deep underground. These miners faced a desperate battle for survival, contending with toxic gas, flooding, and the ever-present risk of further cave-ins. Hospitals and medical facilities critical for treating the injured were not spared. Most were destroyed, and those that remained operational were overwhelmed within hours. Makeshift medical centers sprang up in open fields and among the debris, staffed by a few doctors and nurses who survived. Supplies of antibiotics, painkillers, and bandages were woefully inadequate, forcing medical workers to improvise treatments and prioritize the most critical cases. With the injured numbering in the tens of thousands, triage became a grim and inescapable task. Amidst the destruction, survivors faced immense challenges in securing basic necessities. Access to clean water was nearly non-existent, as pipelines had been shattered and wells contaminated. Food supplies dwindled rapidly, leaving many to scavenge through the wreckage or share meager rations. The summer heat exacerbated these hardships, with temperatures soaring above 37 degrees Celsius, further threatening the health of those already weakened by injury or exhaustion. Survivors banded together in an incredible display of human resilience and solidarity. Men, women, and even children took part in rescue efforts. Using bare hands and simple tools to dig through the rubble, makeshift teams formed spontaneously, driven by the shared hope of finding loved ones alive beneath the debris. Tragically, the majority of those trapped could not be saved, as the sheer scale of destruction and the lack of heavy rescue equipment hindered these efforts. The earthquake also inflicted devastating emotional wounds. Families were torn apart as countless lives were lost in an instant. The grief of those who survived was compounded by the uncertainty surrounding the fate of their loved ones. Makeshift memorials began appearing within days, with survivors placing flowers, candles, and personal mementos near the sites where friends and family had perished. Adding to the catastrophe, aftershocks continued to terrorize the region. These tremors, some significant in their own right, caused further collapses and heightened the fear of those already traumatized by the initial quake. For the residents of Tangshan, the ground beneath them seemed permanently unstable, and each aftershock was a cruel reminder of their vulnerability. As word of the disaster began to spread beyond Tangshan, nearby towns and villages grappled with their own losses. The destruction was not confined to the city alone. Smaller communities were equally devastated, though their struggles often went unnoticed in the shadow of Tangshan's catastrophe. These areas faced similar shortages of water, food, and medical supplies, further straining the limited resources available for relief efforts. In these early days, survival was a test of willpower and ingenuity. The residents of Tangshan and its surrounding areas displayed extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable adversity, setting the stage for a long and arduous recovery. The city's ruins bore silent witness to the resilience of its people, even as the true scope of the disaster was only beginning to emerge. In the months and years following the Tangshan earthquake, the true extent of the disaster became a defining moment in modern Chinese history. The challenges of rebuilding a shattered city, addressing the emotional scars of survivors, and honoring the memory of those lost created a legacy that would shape Tangshan and its people for generations. The Chinese government launched an unprecedented reconstruction effort. Within days of the disaster, engineers and construction crews from across the country descended on Tangshan. Entire neighborhoods were cleared of debris, and temporary shelters were erected to house the displaced population. Despite limited resources, the reconstruction process reflected a commitment to rebuilding not just the city's infrastructure, but its spirit. By the early 1980s, Tangshan began to transform into a symbol of resilience and recovery, with new buildings rising in place of the ruins. Public health initiatives also became a cornerstone of the post-disaster response. The widespread destruction of hospitals and sanitation facilities had led to fears of disease outbreaks. Medical teams worked tirelessly to vaccinate survivors and improve living conditions in temporary camps. Over time, Tangshan emerged as a model For public health planning, in the aftermath of disasters influencing emergency response strategies across China. For the survivors, the earthquake left deep psychological wounds. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of the disaster. Community support networks played a crucial role in helping individuals process their grief. Over the years, storytelling, art, and cultural events became powerful tools for healing, allowing survivors to share their experiences and honor the memories of loved ones. The Tangshan earthquake also catalyzed advancements in earthquake research and preparedness. The scale of destruction highlighted the need for improved building standards and stricter enforcement of construction codes. By the 1990s, Tangshan's new structures were built to withstand earthquakes, reflecting lessons learned from the tragedy. The disaster also spurred the development of early warning systems and a nationwide focus on earthquake education, which have since saved countless lives. Globally, the Tangshan earthquake drew attention to the importance of international solidarity in the face of natural disasters. Although China largely relied on internal resources, offers of aid from other countries marked a significant shift in global disaster response dynamics. The tragedy underscored the shared vulnerability of humanity and the need for collective action to mitigate the impact of such events. In Tangshan today, memorials stand as a testament to the lives lost and the resilience of those who survived. The Tangshan Earthquake Memorial Park, completed in the late 20th century, is a place of reflection and remembrance. Its design incorporates remnants of destroyed buildings and poignant sculptures, ensuring that the memory of the disaster remains alive for future generations. The earthquake also left an indelible mark on Chinese culture. It inspired literature, film, and academic studies, shaping the way disasters are understood and discussed. The stories of survival and courage from Tangshan resonate far beyond the city, serving as a reminder of humanity's strength in the face of unimaginable loss. As the decades have passed, Tangshan has risen from its darkest moment to become a thriving city once again. Its recovery is a testament to the resilience of its people, the power of community, and the lessons learned from one of history's most devastating natural disasters. The legacy of the Tangshan earthquake is not merely one of destruction, but also of rebuilding, healing, and hope for a better future.